Welcome one and all to the international webinar on peace in Europe by Mr. Gunther Fehlinger. About diplomatics, we are an inclusive community dedicated to innovation and excellence in model political competitions. We desire to groom the leaders of tomorrow by providing a touch of political and diplomatic world to young students from school level to university level. We support students and scholars from all over the world and contribute knowledge and expertise locally, nationally, and internationally. Such exposure would be directed towards developing and maintaining overall growth of political as well as diplomatic skills, which can facilitate peaceful resolution. I feel honored to welcome our esteemed speaker for the session, Mr. Gunther Fehlinger. He is an Austrian economist, management and development consultant, podcaster, Pax Europiana. He was an Austrian student leader during the early 1990s. He's an international officer of the Austrian Student Union, chairman of European Democrat Students from 1996 to 1998. He worked in Brussels from 1998 to 2004. Then 4 years as Secretary General of SME Union of EPP from 2005 to present. Mr. Gunther is focused on economic reform and SME policy in European transition countries, mainly Kosovo, Albania, Ukraine. Gunther provides an committee member of investments for technology support of the Agency for Economic Development of North Macedonia. Gunther has a keen interest in energy and infrastructure policy in Central and Eastern Europe. He serves as a board member of AGREEI, Action Group for Regional Economic Integration of Southern Balkans, coordinates a network for tax reforms called Europeans for Tax Reform, and is a former president of Austria-Kosovo Society and former board member of Austrian Albanian Society in Albania. Gunther supports the recognition of Kosovo and freedom for Crimea. Gunther publishes a podcast of European Union called Pax Europiana, runs a video channel focused on European EU enlargement, publishes articles on European Union future and European economic reforms and European Union and NATO enlargement. Gunther advocates for a European Union of 37 members and an enlarged NATO of 42 allies and fast-track Eurozone enlargement. Thank you everyone for joining. Without any further ado, let us begin. I would just like to I would like to ask all the participants to uh, leave their questions in the chat box and we can ask them by the end of the session. I would like the speaker to take the session forward and enlighten us all.
Thanks a lot. That's very kind of you, Garima, for this kind introduction. My name is Gunther Fehlinger, and I'm an Austrian economist, as discussed. And we are in very dramatic times, and I'm very honored that we can discuss about peace in Europe. And unfortunately, peace is there's no peace in Europe anymore since today because of the Russian war against Ukraine. And I call all the participants, all friends of peace, to support Ukraine at this hour of need. And I will guide you now through the situation in my presentation. I think it is a start presentation here. And thanks for your attention. And we will then start here with this first, my introduction. That's also my Twitter. My Twitter handle is on this slide. And also my channel, my podcast channel. You can find it easily on YouTube under Pax Europiana. That's basically my idea of promoting peace under the threat of Russian aggression. Unfortunately, since 2014, we don't have peace in Europe. And today, the 24th of February, is certainly the day in Europe where the next level of escalation has started with this full-scale war, which Russia has started this morning. I'm sure all of you have seen it in the news channels on the world news, because it's a dramatic moment where Ukraine is encircled and now the tank columns come from the north through Belarus, through the east, through the south, through the Black Sea landing, and it's very, very dramatic. Here, this is the start of my presentation. That's basically me. If you want to follow on Twitter, I tweet a lot, maybe too much, every day for peace. And I have also this iPod channel, this podcast channel on Apple iTunes, Pax Europiana, and on also I publish a daily column about Ukraine at this website linked Ukraine Journal. And I'm also very active online. You can reach me anytime, and I'm happy to be in touch. And this is the dramatic moment today, and that's from CNN this morning. And that's basically where all the impact of the first phase of the Russian war are taking place. There's basically in all cities, there was a military impact by some cruise missiles. And you see also then the columns of the tanks moving from Belarus south. And also there's an amphibious landing in the south in Odessa. And there is a full-scale military confrontation going on. That's war. And that's changing everything. So this day today is a very tragic, but also very significant day in the history of the world. And as it's always the case, never forget world history and world wars and all these dramatic events have always started in Europe. So it's really very, very important for everybody in the world to advocate for peace and to call for Russia, which is the power which has started that war, to stop and to withdraw and not to have too many victims, because my voice you hear, I have lived 4 years in Ukraine. I have many friends there, and they are now under threat of their life in this dramatic situation. And there is no reason for this. It's really totally unprovoked and no reason to punish these poor people. The only reason is basically that they want to join the free world. They want to join the European Union and NATO, and therefore they have to be punished. And that's an outrageous thing. I will start in this lecture a bit about history as well, because equally dramatic, it's a continuation of the Cold War in 1946. And it's important to understand that context. There was already the Greek Civil War and the so-called Turkish Strait crisis. So even at that time, there was already the start of this big confrontation. And the Soviet Union, having already half of Europe occupied, is not content and is also very intervening in Greece and threatening Turkey. And in this confrontation, since this moment, we are, and that's basically also the moment then when the decision were taken to found NATO, because after World War II, the Americans wanted to withdraw, but no, they had to stay, they had to found NATO in order to contain the effort of the Soviet Union to take more and more of free Europe and enlarge their empire. And that was then the reason for the so-called Truman Doctrine. And then later in 49, the foundational moment of NATO, where then also Turkey and Greece joined in 51. So this is the Cold War basically, and it was a tremendous effort. It was hugely expensive effort, mainly of America. I have here again, see how the dividing line was going through Europe. And this was a dramatic 40 years of confrontation. It was Cold War. We basically exported our confrontation between the free Europe and the Soviet Union to the rest of the world, because there were a lot of wars in the world, which was led by European powers. But this confrontation to this day is unfortunately never really resolved. And we have this war today again for that. And it's Russia who has started again. Here is the speech of President Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. That's the biggest conference for security issues in the world possible. And it's in Munich. And he was there present, and he has said, against the West, he will basically declare the Second Cold War. And that's exactly how it happened. And this is the consequence of what we face today, is already announced in 2007 in February. And he has made no coincidence about this timing today. Here, I would like to explain also for the international audience, it's not that this is two powers who are competing for land and it's somehow equal distance. No. See how Russia is run by Putin. These are all the opposition leaders here on the media representatives. The most famous is Mrs. Politovskaya. She was shot, the journalist. Yeah? Mr. Gaidar is died. Yeah? There is also Nemtsov. He was shot in 2015. These are the most important opposition leaders. And just recently, Mr. Navalny is now in a kind of prison camp, and totally only because he has criticized Mr. Putin. There's also the poisoning of Mr. Yushchenko, the Ukrainian president. Yeah? Here is the dissident, the KGB agent who turned to the West, and he has told about Putin's rise to power and his Polonial death. And there's tremendous material out there. But I just want to explain moral equal distance is not justified. Yeah? This is the Russia of Putin. It's based on poisoning opposition leader, killing them. And it's really quite a terrible condition. Here comes the world as it is today. Again, here we have the European Union and our trading system and our Western economic system. Here we have the NATO. This is the NATO enlargement I will talk about. And the world is divided here because Putin, after 2008 and 2007, he has built up basically a kind of a counter system. This is called the Eurasian Economic Union, and a counter system, the CSTO, the Collective Security Situation Treaty Organization. It's in a way technically copies, but it's not based on the same level of freedom, of values, or of mutual respect between the nations. It's basically a subordinate system towards Russia, and that's the division of the world as the Russians wanted it, and it was certainly not the wish of us from the West. Here, because very much is conflict now, according to Putin's description, and the so-called 17th December ultimatum is about enlargement of NATO. But enlargement of NATO was never meant as an aggressive kind of imperialist project. Yeah? It's a defensive alliance, which is basically based on the wish of members to join. Nobody was bullied into joining. Nobody was somehow, hey, you have to join. No, it's countries who want to join. And here you see the timeline of the joining. Once the Soviet Union fell apart, there was the countries who wanted to join. And by the way, it was never promised that nobody could promise in the year 1990, because that was Putin always claiming that there is some kind of promise not to enlarge it. This never happened. And even if, who could promise on behalf of Poland or Ukraine in the year 2000, now 1990, that they can never join? Free nations have the right to join the security alliances, and the more aggressive Russia gets, the more all these countries want to be safe by being united, because it's otherwise you see what there is happening. This is the situation. We are still very divided. We have about 12 countries in the European continent who are not in NATO. We are a very fractured and complicated continent, and this is ultimately what I also try to educate. We should have more unity, and we should have more clarity, and we should have also all Europe united. But I always try to explain that in the last 30 years, since the end of the First Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of these countries were integrated in the European Union. It's much better now, the living conditions in Poland, in Romania, in Estonia. They have really caught up a lot. And that's actually a wonderful progress of freedom, prosperity, and also security for these countries. And there's nothing that bad about this. Yeah? Actually, this process will continue. And the more Russia is aggressively pushing against it, the more countries will join, because simply it's an egalitarian organization of freedom and of prosperity. And I call also the other parts of the world, don't assign yourself to this BRICS. This is a serious issue. Putin has built BRICS against the OECD. OECD is the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development. I'm also critical that we are slow in enlargement, but India, South Africa, Brazil, this should be countries joining the OECD, and Brazil will do that now. And I hope also India, South Africa, and most of the countries will join, because who really wants to live under Russian or Chinese conditions? It's pretty terrible. So this is about the European Union enlargement. This is also because it was already my introduction. I'm very much in favor of Ukraine joining the European Union. That would have been actually a workable compromise, which I also advocated. Unfortunately, we lost the United Kingdom. That was a big tragedy. It is to be connected as well always with the so-called refugee crisis and the Syrian civil war, which also Russia had a huge impact because of their disastrous war crimes and the bombing of Syria in the year 2014-15. That has led also to this huge refugee wave and then to the result, which is, of course, a tragedy for the West. But we have now found a trade agreement again with the United Kingdom. And of course, they are the lead NATO partner, and we will also manage this loss. And there will be more countries who want to join the European Union, and that will be very positive. Coming now concrete to the crisis and to the so-called Bucharest summit, I think all students should know about that one because that is the core point now. That is the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. Here, the Americans, George Bush, he proposed Ukraine and Georgia to be in NATO. What happened was then that the Europeans were opposing because they had already big economic interests with Russia. Russia was very against that because from that moment already they thought that Ukraine should be in their orbit. They belong somehow to each other. I don't know how countries can belong to other countries and who owns his neighbor. It's a mystery for me. But the Germans and the French have rejected NATO membership at that summit. It was just theoretically possible. And this led already to the 2008 war against Georgia exactly 3 months later. And that's the starting point. And then we had, of course, a lot of confrontations between the West and Russia after 2013. President Obama was a very weak president. He has not intervened in Syria. And then Russia saw the opening. And this has immediately led also to the Syrian civil war and to the escalation to the refugee crisis and to the Ukraine crisis. What happened in Ukraine exactly was that the EU has offered just a trade agreement. Yeah? This was a free trade agreement, deep and comprehensive, but nothing like membership perspective. No, it was this trade agreement. Then this was too much for Russia. They have enforced that their pro-Russian president has not signed this agreement. And then all these protests came. And then basically very heavy-handed intervention by the Russian-backed security forces of this pro-Russian candidate and the shooting of a lot of civilians among the protesters on the 18th to the 20th of February. And then came this the flight of Yanukovych. He basically ran away. And that was the big tragedy for Putin because his president, his legitimate kind of tool in Ukraine ran away. Then came a pro-European government. And then came the revenge. And it's not a coincidence that all these things are happening exactly in February because it's all connected to the pro-Western turn of Ukraine. Because this losing of Ukraine has led for the revenge. Putin then made this manipulation and this referendum and this little green man, some of you might remember, and he then took Crimea and in March and then started immediately in April already the Donbass war. And since then, since the 6th of April, we have this war in Donbass. That's the region in the east of Ukraine, which all this theoretically now also the military intervention is about. But in reality, it's an 8 years Russian war to punish Ukraine. Here comes a very important point because this war was always fought with Russian weapons. And this Russia is, of course, you know, a very big military power. They have also these Buk weapons and they had given these Buk weapons and the people to use it to the Ukrainian, to these rebels, to the separatists and in Donbass, and they have shot down a civilian airplane. It was very dramatic. 300 people died, and this should never be forgotten because it was a big disaster, and obviously Russia responsible. Then, and there was the big tank battles, and this is already very shocking to say, but in August 2014, we had a big tank battles, and also until basically it was half a year of the hot phase of the war. And that was a big tragedy. Over 15,000 people have died in this war up to now. And there was a first effort to make peace. That's what everybody talks about, Minsk. That's Minsk 1, the first effort in September to make peace. And then Minsk 2, that was the second effort where basically the European leaders were on their knees to Putin to stop his tanks and not invade further. And then was also, that was happened in Minsk, this kind of agreement. And it was agreed to have autonomy. And then in reality, since then, Russia is dominating this republic. So it was, autonomy was always meant to make Western integration of Ukraine impossible. That was unacceptable for the pro-Western Ukraine, because they always understood that they need the NATO and EU protection in order to be safe from Russia. Without that, they are the victim. And today's day has proven that this was completely right, because today, again, they are the victim. Again, to talk about the trade agreement, since 2017, now Ukraine is officially an associated country, a partner country, not a member, not a future candidate, but a partner country. And that's the same status like Moldova and Georgia. And that has been extremely successful, because the integration in the European regulatory and market system has been enormously successful for Ukraine. And that's, of course, a big problem. Now, what is happening in 2021, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia want also to join the European Union. This they have decided in Batumi. They made this event, and this was, of course, a red line, because joining the European Union, we have also mutual obligation, and we are now 27 countries. We have 6 more countries for the Balkans, and we have these 3 countries who want to join. Many Europeans were very skeptical about it. Yeah? But this is the wish of the countries to join ours as a member union, and that is something we cannot reject. And here you see Putin's effort to collect the ex-Soviet Union countries from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. He basically tried to collect his friends, and that was from December 2021. You see then the differences. We have all these countries who are looking for freedom and for this equality and the union of rights, which the European Union is. And then the other countries which are basically bullied into that system. Bullied, I say concretely, because it's really a politics based on Panzer. That's a German word for tanks. But that's exactly what Putin is doing. He is the only serious military might on the European continent. That's his way to do business. And that he has proven again today very shockingly. Now, concrete to this week's event. And this is the recognition of these 2 separatist regions. There is no case for independence in a sense. They will be very soon annexed. I'm confident, similar like Ukraine, like Crimea, because, and the rest of Ukraine, I don't know exactly, we will discuss in a second. But you see this small territory here, there's about 4.5 million people. That's basically an industrial basin with a lot of coals and heavy industry. So that's a lucrative industrial property. And that's basically very easy, close to Russia. And that's what they have anyhow since 8 years, more or less, under military political control. And then there was this kind of fake ceremony organized on Monday. It's a prelude to invasion. And that's my theory, what I say since years now, that we are basically in the second Cold War, and we should do more in order to help Ukraine to join NATO and the EU, or just EU, it would also be one option. And the role model is here in Germany, because Germany was a very similar case like we have now with Ukraine, a divided country, and we have basically had stability in Europe for 40 years. Despite all the conflict. And so it would have been much better than the present escalation and the present war. But this is what Russia has decided for. So basically, that's my comparison between Germany and Ukraine. It was until yesterday 7% of the landmass of Ukraine under Russian control. And that was a possible compromise. But Russia was not satisfied just with 7%. And seemingly they are now ready to take more land. And they have moved significantly into Ukraine today in the morning, actually. And you see the timeline, many people might have forgotten of how complicated the German question was for 40 years with the wall, with the Revolution 53, with the airlift, and then also the Kennedy visit, the historic visit, and then the fall of the wall in 30 years ago. And similar, we have now in Ukraine the last 30 years of history, from the slain opposition candidate Chernobyl to the poisoned Yushchenko. These were the pro-Western leaders of Ukraine, to the Euromaidan, and then to the now already 8 years ongoing occupation of Crimea, Donbass, and now the escalation of yesterday. I would also economically explain why Putin is doing it, because his policy of the last 8 years has been tremendously negative for the Russian economy, and so will also this escalation. I have made the calculation that here in 2012-13, it was still 2.3 trillion, the GDP of Russia. Russia was quite successful in a way in terms of prosperity until the year 2014. And you see how massively declining the GDP output of Russia was because of the lower energy prices, the sanctions, the isolation, the kind of war costs. And this is really dramatically. And also now, today, the tanking of the stock exchange of Russia, the currency will collapse, and it will have very dramatic consequences also for Russia. And Putin is the typical authoritarian who this own failure economically to deliver for his people is then exported in external aggression. That's what he decided to do. And it will result in enormous sanctions and hard-hitting consequences for the Russian economy. But he is one of the richest men in the world, and he seemingly does not care. Here's the military situation, how it presented itself at the beginning of the week, since he has taken over the de facto control of Belarus in the summer. So basically he has the forces in the north. He has all along the eastern border of Ukraine and the occupied Donbass, the forces, and in the Black Sea and Crimea, and he has now decided to use it. This is the situation of today, as the situation is developing. So I can just tell you what happened at 12 o'clock. But this was really very dramatic. And this is my call for everybody in the world to be with solidarity with Ukraine and support Ukraine, because it's a very terrible thing when your bigger neighbor invades you because he doesn't like what you do, because that's what it boils up to. He basically, the bigger military powerful nation, has said that the policy of the smaller nation is not what we like, and therefore the tanks roll and the cruise missiles will be shot. And that's, of course, a big disaster for the world order. And I hope that there will be limited damage, but I'm pessimistic. I think it will be very dramatic. So far, the situation, my presentation. I'm ready for all questions, and I ask you for solidarity with Ukraine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll take some questions from our audience. Sir, do you think United Nations failed to fulfill its duty of preventing any wars among the nations? As League of Nations came to end, as it could not stop the World War, will it also be same for UN, or UN is quiet because of the superpower US, as US has always been dominating these organizations?
Look, I think it's a dramatic moment in the world. Yeah, it's a tidal moment. There is no question about it. And you see that also the League of Nations ended because it was no longer able to keep the peace in Europe. And it's my comparison is that the Soviet Union, for example, was excluded from the League of Nations in December 39 because it has attacked Finland. And so that's was the only time in history when League of Nations or the United Nations has really excluded a country. So I think the UN is very much a paralyzed organization because of the way the five superpowers of the world have who won the Second World War, and they have kept this veto power and they have not adopted to the change. And because the UN is a very good organization in principle, it's for peace. That is the idea, for human rights, for democracy. But because of the changes that China fell to the communists in 49, and they have then in 71 inherited the seat of China. And then we have, of course, Russia as the Soviet Union from the beginning, which was in aggressive power. I was one of the people already in 91 to say why Russia inherits the seat of the Soviet Union. It was a very big mistake because the Soviet Union was double the size and was really very important, okay? But Russia was only half of it, and Ukrainians were also inheriting the Soviet Union in a sense. And then why to give it the seat? That was a big mistake. And it's also a big mistake that when you really that, for example, India is now one of the largest nation, I think, together with China on the same level, 1.4 billion. But India, because it was 4 years later only independent after San Francisco conference, you came 4 years late, and you were never allowed to be on the number one table. It's a lot of inconsistencies. And I think that, no, we will not have an end of the United Nations, but the Russian aggression, this war against Ukraine, and also the consequent action of Russia and China always working with each other in the United Nations, it has to lead to a reform of the United Nations, or maybe also to the foundation of a new United Nations, like a union of democracies, which is an alternative. But I'm in favor of reforming the United Nations into with 10 security powers, that is also including India, and nobody single having a veto power. And also, I think that now, after this war, there should be a suspension of Russia, because it's an openly aggressive act against the Charter of the United Nations, and this cannot stand.
We have another question. Do you think putting sanctions on Russia was a clever move by US? As we know, these sanctions are too small when there is a condition of war among the two nations, Russia and Ukraine.
Look, the sanctions work. The sanctions work. They had an impact because they were very targeted sanctions. Because after 2014, the EU has made it, and also the United States has always made the effort not to hurt the Russian people, not to hurt the Russian economy too much, because we never instituted a trade embargo or something like this. It was always very much about the people very close to Putin, his oligarchs, to be limited in their trade and their properties and their other activities and their travel. And that was very good, I think. It was because, you know, there was also a little bit of confusion in 2014, what it is exactly, you know. And so it was a good compromise in my way. It has already hurt very much the Russian state and economy. But of course, now in this escalation, I think we have to go much further and really limit the trade of Russia directly. That will be not easy, and it will hurt, of course, the world economy. It will hurt Russia very much. And I think economically, the history has proven that a weaker empire, which is so aggressive and leads an expensive war outside, like the Soviet Union has done in Afghanistan, that when the West is united, the free world, which we have still about half of the world GDP. So if we exclude Russia from our economies, then the Russian future will be very bleak, and it will be very dramatic decline of Russia. And that is basically the start of the decline of Russia.
Next question is, what has been done by USA to prevent this invasion? As USA, the troops were there at the border when, then why it happened?
Look, Biden is probably the most experienced politician on the world at the moment. Yeah, he was since 1973 in the Senate. He knows really very much Europe better than all of us. And his policy towards Putin was very, very good, I think, because what happened? He met him in Geneva. He gave him a lot of direct time. You know, it was not that. Biden has really engaged and gave a lot of opportunities for Putin to present his cases and to discuss it very seriously. And so it was a constructive form of dialogue and of because Russia ultimately is not the most important economic power in the world in a sense, but of course it has nuclear weapons. It has to be taken serious. but the Americans have acted now also very clever that all the information they gave immediately to the public. President Biden has now since 1 month said that this war is coming. And all European leaders, and inclusive also the analysts and experts like me, have said, no, the Americans are exaggerating. It will not come. It will not come. Putin will never attack. But he has attacked. So ultimately, the Americans have been totally correct in their assessment. And to avoid it, I think what could have been done is, of course, to integrate Ukraine into NATO and to say, stop it here. Otherwise, we will attack. But obviously, to this kind of security guarantee, the Americans were not ready because everybody is afraid of a big nuclear war with Russia and of a big world war where now basically then the Russian and the American forces clash over Ukraine. And this is still a possibility. And of course, nobody wants that. But the result is that we basically sacrifice the Ukrainians because they get, without any protection of American air power, they get now the cruise missiles and the rockets unprotected into the cities.
Okay, so there's a question from Karen. My uncle lives in Ukraine since 30 years or more, and he said that half of the Ukrainian people are with Russia. What is your opinion about such situation?
Look, before, because there were a lot of changes in Ukraine already, and a lot of people have relatives. Ukraine and Russia, they are now 350 years more or less in the same empire. So a lot of Ukrainians have families in Moscow or in Yekaterinburg. A lot of Russians have family, and really family, like sister, auntie, tante, not kind of brothers in arms, but real families. So it's a division line inside the family. It's very, very hard. But now, since 30 years, Ukraine is independent. And of course, in the beginning, there were still a lot of economic ties with Russia. But since the 2004 moment, when the Orange Revolution came, Ukraine was moving the first time towards the West, and there was still a 50-50 situation. But in 2014, when Ukraine moved the second time or the third time actually to the West, because already in 94 they tried, but then it was in 2014 was like this, that Putin made the revenge of the Crimea and the revenge of the war. And the war in Donbass led to the fact that a lot of Ukrainians, they were fighting in the Donbass against this because they hated that. And also their children were drafted as soldiers. And you can believe me, when after you see then the young Ukrainian soldiers being carried at the funeral through the city of Kiev or Lviv, and that then this idea that Russia is a really nice brotherly nation was losing a lot of support. And today, whenever everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian, some as a second language, some as a mother language, they are very, they have the same cultural heritage, obviously. But their idea that the Russians are their brothers, and this has died on the battlefields of Donbass. And if the last guys who were now still positive maybe about Russia, they cannot understand why Russia, who is their brother, comes now with the rockets into their cities. And they have done nothing wrong. They were just living their life. You know, it's for completely, even when you are the most pro-Russian in Ukraine, you don't want to die on the chains of a Russian tank. And so I think that idea is over forever.
Could this conflict lead to expansion of NATO?
Look, sure. Because all countries, first of all, I want to make it a time, because in the English world, they always like to talk about expansion. Expansion is what empires do. For example, the Roman Empire expanded. NATO is not the empire. We are not like grabbing countries. Yeah. So it's more enlargement, because countries, they decide by their own in their parliaments or with referendum that they want to be in one security alliance. And so there is, for example, a big debate now in Sweden and Finland. These are two traditional and neutral countries in Europe. They have discussed if it's like this, that Russia is attacking other countries, if it's like this, that Russia is issuing warnings against us, then we want to maybe to really discuss our future ourselves, because these are proud nations, and they have said yes, it's us, the Swedes and the Finns, who decide about our situation. We are not kind of dependency of Russia. So that's a possibility. And it's also possible that countries like who want to have a majority for NATO, it's Kosovo and Bosnia. They also want to join. And also Georgia wants to join. They are the 4 aspirant countries for NATO membership, Bosnia, and it's Ukraine, Georgia. And they really, I think, in the case of Ukraine, you will see, I don't know what will stay over of Ukraine under the Russian tanks. But the country, which Russia will, because it will not invade the whole country, I guess, but the free Ukraine, maybe it's limited, less territory, less people. But this free Ukraine definitely will want to join NATO, because they certainly don't want to be neutral after what happens today. And they will ask, please help us, America, please defend us in the future, Europe, because we have done nothing wrong. So the answer is yes, it will lead to expansion. I think we will have about 6 to 7 countries more in the future.
Okay, so what do you think the future of Europe will be in wake of this invasion?
Look, the future of Europe, we have our own conference process now, because we are not as unified country as the United States of America or India, for example. But we are quite similar, because India is also a nation, a federation of many, many federal states. I don't know exactly. I think it's 30 states in India. We have now 27, and we have another 6 countries which are candidate countries, potential candidate countries. And we have also Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which are also considering, and they want to join. So I think what we will be more unified. And because in the case of this Russian aggression, and I think that will be for many decades now, we are not, even when the war might stop now, tomorrow, or in 2 weeks, or in 1 year, I don't know when it will stop, but it will not change. There will be always this level of threat, because this is a moment no European politician or voter will ever forget, to have the Russian tanks running into Ukraine. So the result is we will be more unified, and we will move closer to a model of the United States of America in the coming years. This will be also many complicated decisions, but we will be actually stronger out of this. We will also include more countries who want to join the European Union. And we will also share more resources, and we will be a more powerful continent, and hopefully a good partner for India to be very successful as part of the free world against autocracy and the threat of war by Russia and China. That's the future.
So do you feel a strong position of Ukraine in NATO could help it override this current crisis?
Look, I think that if we had already 2008 allowed Ukraine to join, there would have been no war in 2014, because then Ukraine would have been NATO member, and that's it. Nobody will ever attack NATO. There is certainly no way to do that because of the overwhelming American firepower, the nuclear umbrella, and our unity. So that was a mistake not to do it. And again, I was, after 2014, to make a compromise with Russia, I said very clear, let's do it like a divided Ukraine into the NATO and EU, and we can do nothing for Crimea and for Donbass. That's very sorry, but we could have done a lot for the Ukrainians, and it's 40 million people. But the Western leaders, they were not ready, because a lot of economic interests of Russia and energy treaties, and a lot of fear of Putin, because obviously what happened today, he could have done already in 2015. And so they have decided against it. And so the Ukrainians are now left alone to fend off the Russian tanks alone.
Do you think that we are going to see a third world war if China enter an attack?
No, first of all, I don't think that we will face a third world war. Because why? The logic is always a tragic logic, but we are always living under the same nuclear deterrent and the balance of nuclear power. It has not changed since 1949. And the situation is that the world destruction, which means a third world war, is basically that the nuclear umbrellas keep us safe. So don't worry, there will be no third world war with all probability and likelihood this is not going to happen. But it's always a risk in some ways, obviously. But no, I don't think so. So the situation is with China. I think that China, now the reaction is that they were like calling for peace more. I don't think that China is an aggressive power which is really very happy about this war. And I think they are now having some feeling of loyalty towards Russia. But I don't think that they have not attacked and invaded anybody since 1979 when they attacked Vietnam. And since they have changed away from Russia in 79 under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, they have been actually internally, they are a disaster, you know, in many ways. They are communist dictatorship, and there's a lot of things wrong in China. But I don't think that they will be aggressive. I don't think they will attack Taiwan. I don't think they will attack India. Because why? Because they are part of the world economy and they are very much depending on our markets. So to break the house is not the interest of the Chinese. They want to be the master of the house, yes. But they don't want to break the global economy or the global security situation. They want to maybe change it, but they are not going for war now.
Do you have any information about China, Iran, Korea, if they're going to make any step?
I don't think the Iranians are also, because in this kind of, you can call it evil camp, you know, you can call it the autocrat, this kind of Russian Chinese camp, yeah. It's also Nicaragua, Cuba, Syria, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea. You know, you have this kind of axis of evil, which was famously called in some years. But the Iranians, and they are not so loyal members of that one in a way. The Iranians are much more interested in the shadow of the Russian-European conflict to make their own deals with the West and to get the nuclear deal done. They are not big friends of Putin or of China. This is just a kind of convenient for them. And they really have their own ideological basis and they have their own problems in the Middle East. And they are certainly not seeing the world as something they have to obey to the orders of Putin or Xi. So I don't think there will be a very harmonized response. On the contrary, the Iranians are much more interested in such a crisis to make their own separate deals with everybody else who is ready to engage with them, because they don't see themselves as an inferior nation to Russia or China, but as their own powerful kind of ideological and regional power.
Will such war affect the economic growth of the European countries?
Look, of course, it has an impact, yeah, because there is no doubt because of the energy consequences mainly. Because not so much because the energy prices, you know, of course, the energy prices have now reached $105 again. So that's expensive. That is important. But the consequences are much more dramatic because the consequences is that we will change the European energy system. Because what we see now that we don't want to be complicit in the Russian aggression. Basically, Russia can build all this army only with our money. And additionally, we have climate change anyhow. So now we have already left nuclear in Germany, especially, and we have decided to end coal. And I think we will also reduce the gas consumption in Europe dramatically. That's very expensive, but we are a very rich continent. So we will import from other parts of the world. That's also sure, from Qatar and from America. But we will also change our economic system. But in the long term, this will be very beneficial for us because we will be very green and very innovative continent. We will be less dirty in terms of energy consumption. That is also positive. And the impact which we have is unfortunate, obviously, because now after Corona, we have the next big external shock. This is, of course, expensive. But luckily, because of the security and economic infrastructure of Europe in NATO and the EU, we are kind of a really very rich continent, and we can sustain even the next shock. And let me make the joke, not joke, but a little bit, because I know a lot of people from India watch. If we, for example, make a free trade agreement with India now, we can more than compensate these negative shocks, because India is a very important partner for the European Union, and we are negotiating already a free trade agreement. And if now in this shock with Russia and the war, we will find a new understanding with India, we can easily compensate and get very successful for the next century to come without the Russian carbon or nuclear industry, because ultimately the Russians have very little to sell but gas or uranium or coal or petroleum, because it's not a very innovative economy. And India, by the way, is a very innovative economy. We can really do a lot of great things together. And that was much more decisive for us than these gas reserves from Siberia.
Do you think USA and NATO occupied with Russia in Europe can China make a move against Taiwan?
Look, it's possible, but I said already, I don't think the Chinese leadership is authoritarian communists. They are not nice people. They are, of course, very hard, especially to the Chinese and to their minorities. And I criticize that, and to Hong Kong. But, China to take Taiwan, obviously, that's a temptation. Yeah? I'm sure some strategists in China discuss it. But the whole character of the Chinese is not a risk-taking kind of elite. Yeah? They hate risk. And Taiwan is a heavily armed island. It is also able to defend itself. Yeah? They have a lot of American hardware. And it's very difficult to conquer. And so, because of it's an island in the sea, so you have to have an invasion army. You have to have a lot of transport capacities. This is very, very expensive. And the probability that it works when most of the Taiwanese Chinese are really very much against it. Yeah? And it's an island, and it's very expensive. And the Americans will definitely oppose it. Yeah? And they have still the biggest fleet in the world by far. So I think that would be a kind of totally destruction of China as we know it. And that I think they are certainly not ready. And even I think that this whole argument is a bit of this anti-China lobby of the Americans coming, because they always were Trump beating up the yellow peril, because they loved Putin. And then they were going into racist anti-China card, which is obviously easy to play in the West, and then the anti-communist card. But the Chinese have, to my best knowledge, not made any aggressive move in the last 40 years. And they have actually been our allies in the Cold War. In the second phase of the Cold War in the 80s, the Chinese were helping the West in Afghanistan. They were helping against the Soviet Union. They were even in the 70s, which was the most complicated phase, helping us. So I don't think they don't want to rock the boat. They must have, if Beijing wants now to attack Taiwan, they must be completely crazy to do that. And I think, they are maybe very brutal dictators over there, but they are certainly not crazy. They are very calculating, and they would be completely badly advised if they do it. And so I don't think that this will happen.
So how do you think India can help Ukraine in this time of crisis?
I have put this nice picture of the Berlin symbol. You can put your beautiful Taj Mahal in the colors of Ukraine, for example, or another building, a government building. At this moment, nobody expects the Indians to cross the Himalaya to attack Russia or something. It's not the way. And what you can do is, in the United Nations, make a protest. You can make a simple lighting of your government building in the colors of Ukraine. You can make a nice protest in New Delhi at the street with a flag of Ukraine. And you can break your Soviet-Indian friendship treaty of 71. You can leave the BRICS, and Mr. Modi can call Mr. Putin that he will never meet him again when he is not going out of this country. Because imagine, for example, for India to be attacked by China, or, you have also very big problematic border situation of Kashmir, as I know, between Pakistan. And imagine that there would be some military incursions because somebody can do it and you are in the moment of weakness. So this is completely unacceptable. And there's many ways India can do that, like I made already very clear, because I have seen many kisses of Mr. Putin and Mr. Modi and hugs, and that's not the way to treat him anymore. And you can stop the free trade agreement which you have done with the Euro Economic Asian Union, and to sign a free trade agreement with us. And with the UK, for example, you can join the OECD and be part of the free world. That would be wonderful, like Brazil and Argentina are now doing. And you can transform. The biggest help actually is that you somehow are not neutral morally, but you say invasions are wrong. And the biggest help you can do is to be very successful market economy. Because the more democratic India is, the more successful India is. You are like a proof for the world that democracy and markets work. And Russian and Chinese model has worked a bit, as long as the resources were there and there is this enormous catch-up phase. But if you want to do something for the world and for Ukraine, be very successful back home in India. And that will be the proof of our systems, because we are in a competition for values as well, and in a competition for which system is better. It's autocracy or democracy, and you are the lightning house for a developing country, which is a democracy, also complicated, but working and very successful. You have overtaken the United Kingdom now in the GDP. If you can, for example, be as successful as China, the world will be very successful, the free world, and please join the free world. Now I don't hear you, Garima.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, now I hear
Thank
you.
you so much for such a vibrant, interactive, and knowledgeable session. I would like all the participants to fill in the feedback form. I would like to thank all the participants for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining. If you don't want to miss any updates, you can follow Diplotix on our social media handles, and also join the WhatsApp group updates sent in the chat box. The sir also has a podcast channel and a YouTube channel. You can also follow that.
It's Pax Europiana.
Yeah, it is Pax Europiana.
Peace in Europe.
Peace in Europe. Okay. Thank you so much. I'll be ending the session. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and support Ukraine.
Sure,
Bye.
sir. Bye.